The room was heavy with tension, the kind that pressed against the chest and made every breath feel shallow. Dust hung in the air, caught in the beams of the single flickering light overhead, giving the abandoned warehouse an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. Shadows stretched across the cracked concrete floor, twisting around piles of old crates and broken machinery. She stood near the center, calm, her back straight, hands relaxed but ready. Her gaze swept the room, noting every detail, the jagged edges of the shattered windows, the weak points in the ceiling where beams had rotted over the years, the scattered debris that could either be an obstacle or a weapon. The group of men surrounding her didn't notice her scanning. They were too focused on their own assumptions, too confident in their supposed dominance. They were armed, of course. Pistols, knives, and at least one shotgun leaned heavily in the hands of men who thought themselves untouchable. Their eyes moved constantly, darting to each other for silent signals, calculating angles, assuming she was trapped, vulnerable, and outmatched. They thought they could intimidate her with a simple show of force. She could see it in their posture, the overconfidence, the slight smirk on their leader's face. It was a mistake they were about to regret. Her training had drilled her to observe, to calculate, to anticipate. Every second here counted, every twitch, every flicker of expression mattered. Her heart beat steadily, a rhythm that belied the adrenaline surging through her veins. Years of conditioning had taught her to control her fear, to harness it rather than be consumed by it. The men whispered among themselves, testing the air, mocking her silently. She looks small, one said. Hardly a threat, another added. They didn't know she had endured months of the harshest training, that she had been molded in environments where failure was deadly and hesitation even more so. Her mind worked at lightning speed, calculating distances, angles, and potential outcomes. She noticed that the nearest exit was partially blocked by a stack of crates and that the far corner offered the only real concealment if she needed it. Every scenario was accounted for. They stepped closer, circling like predators, thinking they could intimidate her into submission. Their movements were sloppy, predictable, fueled by arrogance rather than skill. She barely had to move to stay out of reach, her foot shifting slightly to maintain balance, her stance subtle yet perfectly aligned for rapid response. Her eyes were calm, yet every sense screamed alertness. She noticed the man in front trying to mask his nervousness with bravado, the tension in his jaw, the faint tremor in his fingers as they hovered near his weapon. She smiled inwardly. Their confidence was a fragile armor, and it would shatter in seconds. Then, without a word, the atmosphere changed. She allowed a small shift in her stance, a movement so slight it could be mistaken for casual adjustment. But in that moment, she made her presence known, not through shouting, not through aggression, but through absolute control. Her gaze locked onto the leader, unwavering, assessing, calculating. He stiffened under her calm, felt the weight of her attention, and realized, perhaps too late, that this was no ordinary girl. There was a stillness in her, a silent warning that only trained combatants could recognize. She was ready, precise, lethal if provoked. The men hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The smirks that had marked their arrogance faded, replaced with the creeping unease of doubt. The room felt smaller, every shadow pressing closer as if the warehouse itself recognized the shift in power. The air became thick, charged with anticipation, each second, stretching into eternity. She could almost hear their thoughts racing, the tiny cracks forming in their bravado. One man swallowed hard, another shifted his weight nervously, and the leader's grip on his pistol tightened, not in readiness but in fear. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, soft even, but it carried the authority of someone who had faced life and death countless times. "You shouldn't have underestimated me," she said. The words were simple, almost casual, yet they carried the weight of warning. The echo of her voice seemed to fill the entire space, bouncing off the walls and embedding itself in the minds of the men. Every eye turned toward her, and in that instant, the dynamic of the room changed completely. No one moved. They understood, instinctively, that she was not ordinary, that the next few seconds would decide their fates. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the faint creak of old floorboards under the weight of uncertainty. In that stillness, she remained calm, a figure of composed power in the center of chaos. Her breath was measured, her body ready, and her mind a steel trap of strategy. She waited, knowing that once she acted, there would be no hesitation. The moment was suspended, poised on the knife edge of action. And though no one yet knew it, in this very instant, they had all been defeated. Not by force, not by rage, but by a presence so disciplined, so lethal, that to challenge it would be madness. She was ready to show them exactly what it meant to face a marine combat master. The first strike was almost imperceptible, a blur of motion that left the men reeling before they even realized what had happened. One moment, they were circling confidently, guns raised, assuming she would cower or beg, and the next, their positions were chaos incarnate. Her hands moved with deadly precision, disarming the nearest man in a fluid motion that was both beautiful and terrifying. The gun clattered to the concrete floor, the metallic echo resonating through the warehouse, announcing her presence as more than mere survival. She didn't shout, didn't hesitate. She flowed from one motion to the next, each calculated to neutralize without unnecessary aggression, each move revealing the depth of her mastery. The second man lunged, knife glinting under the dim light, and she sidestepped with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Her elbow connected with his chest in a fraction of a second, sending him sprawling against a stack of crates. His weapon slipped from his grasp as his body crumpled, and he gasped, trying to comprehend how he had been so easily overpowered. The others froze, their confidence evaporating like mist in the morning sun. They were trained, yes, but nothing in their training had prepared them for her. They had assumed she was fragile, ordinary, a civilian caught in circumstances beyond her control. Now, their assumptions were shattered, replaced with a visceral, creeping fear that tightened their chests and made their breaths shallow. Her eyes scanned the remaining men, calculating the next move with cold efficiency. She noticed their mistakes instantly, the way one man's foot was slightly forward, exposing him to a sweep, the slight angle of another's wrist, leaving him vulnerable to a disarm. She moved toward them, not aggressively, but with an undeniable authority that demanded attention. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, precise. She struck, and each man found himself momentarily incapacitated, unable to raise his weapon, unable to react in time. It wasn't sheer strength. It was timing, strategy, and the years of training that allowed her to predict their every move. The leader, realizing the tide had turned, shouted orders, but his voice trembled, betraying his own fear. "Get her. Don't let her," but his words cut off as she approached with effortless speed. She didn't even need to touch him to assert dominance, her presence alone conveyed a lethal warning. He realized, as his men faltered, that he had underestimated her. The calculation that had given him confidence moments before was gone, replaced with the chilling realization that he was facing someone who could end the confrontation with minimal effort. A sudden movement, a hand reaching for a weapon, was met with a precise kick that sent the man staggering backward. Another attempt at aggression was thwarted with a swift twist of the wrist, neutralizing the threat without unnecessary force. Every motion, every strike, was controlled, efficient, and devastatingly effective. The men were no longer a threat, they were obstacles being removed one by one, and they knew it. Their whispers of bravado had turned to desperate murmurs, their confidence eroded by the undeniable skill displayed before them. Fear replaced arrogance in a heartbeat, leaving them paralyzed with indecision. She paused briefly, allowing them a moment to register the situation. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, her eyes unwavering, locking with each of theirs in turn. She didn't shout, didn't gloat, there was no need. The damage was already done. The realization that they were outmatched, completely outclassed, sank into their minds like cold water. They had thought this would be an easy intimidation, a simple show of force against someone they assumed was weak. Instead, they found themselves facing a human storm, composed and controlled, whose every movement carried the precision of countless hours of grueling training. The warehouse seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in as the tension thickened. The men flinched at every subtle shift, every glance, realizing that even standing still was dangerous. She could end it in seconds, and they knew it. It wasn't her aggression that terrified them, it was her discipline, her unwavering control, the sheer inevitability of her actions. One wrong move, one hesitation, and they would be incapacitated, disarmed, or worse. The weight of her presence was suffocating, yet mesmerizing. They watched, unable to comprehend how someone so unassuming could wield such devastating skill, and yet the proof was before their eyes. In those moments, a profound silence fell over the room. The clatter of weapons on concrete, the rustling of footsteps, the shallow breathing of the men, all became insignificant under the shadow of her mastery. She moved toward the center again, a silent statement that the confrontation was no longer theirs to control. Every instinct in their bodies screamed retreat, yet pride and fear clashed, leaving them frozen. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price with nothing more than hesitation. In that suspended moment, they realized the undeniable truth. They were no match for her, not in skill, not in strategy, and not in willpower. She was a marine combat master, and the battlefield, no matter how confined or unconventional, was entirely hers. The leader's eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking a plan, a weak point, anything that could give him an advantage. But there was none. Every escape route, every potential attack vector had already been accounted for in her mind, mapped out with precision. The warehouse had become a chessboard, and she was 3 moves ahead of everyone in it. Even the shadows seemed to obey her, stretching across the floor and walls in a way that accentuated her presence, her dominance, her control. Her opponents realized, belatedly, that they weren't just facing a trained fighter, they were facing a strategist, a combat master who could predict their actions before they even occurred. The leader tried to assert authority again, his voice breaking as he barked orders. "Take her down, now." But the words fell flat, impotent against the reality that had already settled over the room. His men hesitated, each one weighing the risk of advancing against the certainty of defeat. Their hands trembled as they reached for their weapons, and in that moment, she struck again, not with brutality but with flawless efficiency. A sweeping leg knocked one man off his feet, another's wrist twisted just enough to disarm him without causing permanent harm, and yet another's knife was yanked from his grasp and sent spinning across the floor. The sound of metal against concrete rang sharply, a punctuation in the symphony of her control. The leader realized, finally, that he was powerless. His chest heaved as he struggled to maintain composure, but fear had already infiltrated his mind, clouding judgment, slowing reaction. Every instinct screamed retreat, yet pride and disbelief held him in place. He had underestimated her from the beginning, a mistake that now seemed impossible to recover from. She advanced slowly, deliberately, each step measured, her eyes locked on his. She didn't need to strike. The knowledge of her capability was enough to force compliance. Her presence radiated authority, and in that aura, the men felt the crushing weight of their own inadequacy. "You should have left when you had the chance," she said, her voice calm, controlled, and impossibly steady. The leader swallowed hard, realizing that resistance was not only futile but potentially disastrous. His men flinched at her words, the subtle threat contained within them as potent as any weapon. They were surrounded by someone whose skill, discipline, and confidence dwarfed their own, and the truth was undeniable. Her training, her experience, and her mastery had transformed what could have been a chaotic, violent encounter into a controlled, precise display of power and strategy. One by one, the men lowered their weapons, their hesitation giving way to reluctant submission. Even the leader's hands trembled as he finally set his gun down, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the warehouse lights. The threat had passed not through forceful domination but through sheer competence and the quiet assertion of authority. Every motion she had made, every decision, had been designed to demonstrate that resistance was pointless. The room, once filled with aggression and anticipation, now echoed with the realization of her mastery. She took a step back, giving them space, letting the enormity of the situation sink in. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, the calm in her demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos they had expected. The men were disarmed, both physically and mentally, their bravado shattered. They had come here thinking to intimidate, to assert dominance, to challenge someone they perceived as weak. Instead, they faced the consequence of underestimating a marine combat master. They were beaten, not by rage or brute force, but by skill, strategy, and the quiet, undeniable authority of someone who had trained for precisely these moments. The leader finally spoke, his voice subdued, almost reverent. Who are you?" he asked, the question trembling on his lips. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to justify herself with lengthy explanation. She merely stated it, simply and with absolute certainty. "I'm a marine combat master." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They didn't just describe her skill. They encapsulated the control, the discipline, and the lethal precision she had demonstrated in moments that could have been deadly. The men understood the truth immediately, and in that understanding, they were defeated entirely. She allowed herself a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, before turning toward the exit. The confrontation was over. The men remained on the floor, dazed, shaken, and humbled, realizing that the encounter had never been about intimidation. It had been about the undeniable, inescapable reality of her capability. She walked through the warehouse, every step deliberate, every motion a quiet testament to mastery. By the time she disappeared into the night, the room was left silent, filled with the echoes of a lesson learned. No one should ever underestimate a marine combat master.